The race is on, and it will certainly feel like that for those burning the midnight oil to prepare their shiny new F1 cars for launches and pre-season testing. We're looking ahead to launch season and the major challenges of the season to come. Who's looking hot and who's not, and what can we expect from the new machines when they finally start to break cover? I'm Ed Straw, and my guest today will be the race's newest signing, race-winning F1 car designer Gary Anderson, and my fellow F1 correspondent Scott Mitchell. So Gary, first podcast for the race?
Yes, it's great to be here doing it. We're all about excited for the start of the season, and testing's just around the corner, so it's a lot of pressure on the teams right at the moment, but it's not far away, and Australia's quite important. They just got to get all that work done at testing first before they get to Australia so that they can pick up those results from the start of the season. That's the important issue, so the teams have got a lot of hard work to do in the next month.
And I imagine it's probably a bit more relaxing for you doing this podcast, whereas in your F1 technical director or other role days, this would have been a bit of a frantic period of the year.
Yeah, it is a frantic period. I mean, it's all workshop based as such, but you've got all the tests, all the FIA tests, all the crash tests to get through. You got to try and understand your car. Development's still continuing hard and fast, but at some point in time, you've got to sort of tick the box to get the parts made to get a car on four wheels to get to the Barcelona test. But in the background, as I say, you're still developing the same car, because there's, from the test starting in the middle of February to the middle of March, there's still a month there. So you can add a lot of time to the car if you get the right bits sorted out. But still, you've got to make a car and have it on four wheels for those tests, because reliability comes from running, track running, just understanding the car. And you've got to get there, and you've got to get the miles in.
Well, it won't be long before the cars are out running and testing. We'll all be there, including Scott Mitchell. Are you looking forward to heading out for testing in Spain, or are you focused on the launch week that we've got to come probably next week?
Well, launch week will be quite fun, although because the regulations are the same, not really the sort of surprises, I suppose, or sort of innovations that you might spot. So testing is probably a bit more exciting this year. I won't be believing pretty much anything that Ferrari do or say at testing this year, especially after it wasn't so much that everyone else got it wrong. They got it so badly wrong last year in terms of their own evaluation of how they were doing. So launches is fun, because the launch week is when it really feels like the season's about to begin. But testing for me is the really interesting bit, because you can't. There's only so much you can gain from what a car looks like. Although if Mercedes do what they did last year with the launch, I think you said at the time, Gary, that we got a pretty good idea that Merc weren't messing around when they did their shakedown last year. So yeah, looking forward to it all getting underway.
Well, first up, let's have a little bit of a talk about the challenges of this year, because Gary, this is kind of it's almost a 2019 part 2, isn't it? In that there's no significant rule changes. Obviously, we had the front wing changes last year and a few other details, but this is very much a continuation, isn't it? Even the same tyres that the tyres Pirelli had planned to bring in this year, the change specification got ditched because the teams didn't get on with them. So does that change things when you've got a situation that it's a much more straightforward kind of step from one year to the next?
Well, it does change it, because, as you say, it's sort of 2019 part 2, or a continuity of 2019. There's just been a big gap between the last race and the first race. But in reality, going back to 2019, I was a little bit disappointed in some of the teams, and Ferrari was one of them, because we had this front wing controversy, I suppose, where the wings changed, and then Ferrari built this wing with a lot of outwash. The outside of the wing swept down to the outside of the front tyre, to allow the airflow around the outside of the front tyre to be more consistent. And Mercedes didn't. They went the other way. They created a downforce in the front wing. I'm sort of surprised that during 2019 we didn't see that converge more. Mercedes did do quite a few bits and pieces. They did drop their outside of their wing a bit. But Ferrari never really did anything in that area to try to converge with Mercedes. So it'll be interesting to see, because that's a bit like a light switch. While you've got continuity in the regulations from 2019 to 2020, why not get on with it and build up that base knowledge of what these changes would do? Now, it's very, the rest of the car obviously is very critical to how the airflow comes off the front wing. So you may have to change a lot of parts to make it work with the front wing changes. However, Ferrari have never struggled for a budget or ambition to do something. So from my point of view, the teams that didn't try to fix their problem near the end of the season probably, will suffer for it this year because they're sort of potentially it could be a step ahead, but actually they're a step behind now. So it'll be interesting to see what these new cars look like. Who does push harder for the change in that area? Because, as I say, the front wing dictates the airflow to everything down the car. So it's the first thing first part of the concept that you sort of come up with, and then you make the rest of the car work around it. So it'll be interesting to see that first test. Going to be important visually.
That front wing question is interesting because some teams, Renault for example, struggled to get anything out of the barge boards because they hadn't really got the front wing set up right, so they could be set up for big change. But it's interesting, Scott, because you said on last week's podcast that Binotto had suggested they'd stick with the sort of same front wing concept. I guess within that there is room for them to go a little bit more loaded in the outboard if they want to and still have that effect. But that does seem to be the most interesting thing for me with the new cars. It's who does look like a continuation and who makes a big shift. So who are the front runners are you most interested to see in terms of answering some of those questions?
Well, I want to see exactly what Ferrari comes up with, because it seems I know that there's lots that you can do, but it does seem to be a little bit contradictory for them to be prioritising finding ways to have more efficient and more efficient car, but greater peak downforce than they had last year. But also they don't seem to want to veer away from the concept that they had last year. So I'm sure there must exist some compromise between the two, but it just feels a little bit like sort of Ferrari pretty much saying one thing and then potentially doing the other. So I'm curious to see exactly what they come up with. One thing that we won't see, which will be under the covers, will be what they've talked about with overhauling some of the cylinder technology that they're employing on the engine. Obviously, we won't necessarily see that, but it's just going to be curious to see exactly how much visibly has changed on the Ferrari, and then also maybe if Mercedes is reacting to anything, because the progress that Red Bull made over the course of 2019, they were they were probably the worst affected by that front wing rule change, and the way they were manipulating the airflow from the front wing before that was obviously at a very high level, and they just didn't get it right last year. But they made good progress over the course of 2019. They seem to really get it right. So Red Bull, in theory, I don't know if we can say they ended last year with the best car or the best aero, but in theory they're really well placed to just evolve into this year. Ferrari pretty evidently needed to make progress. Mercedes, I don't know. They're not exactly the type to rest on their laurels, are they, Gary?
No, they're not, and I agree 100% with what you're saying there. That's really what I was saying earlier. Red Bull did react to the situation they had last year. They did put other parts in the car. They did recognise their problem, and they did rectify it. And they probably ended the season, as the strongest of those top three teams. So if they can continue that curve into 2020, then they'll start the season very strong. And that's what Red Bull have got to do, because they've thrown away quite a few potential championships by not starting strong enough at the beginning of the season. You got to get the points on the board, because that changes the pressure that will be on the other teams. That changes the pressure that will be on Mercedes. If suddenly somebody's nipping at your heels or even a couple of points in front of you, it's a whole different deal to going into race 4 or 5 of the season, and you got a 20, 25, 30 point lead in the championship. The pressure's different from if you're 1 or 2 points apart. So if Red Bull can continue their curve of development into the beginning of 2020, the interesting thing for me is I don't live far away from the Red Bull factory, and twice in the last 2 weeks I've driven past their factory. One was on a Sunday, and there was not one car in the car park. This is about 2 weeks ago. And last week I drove past it on a Saturday, and there was about 10 cars in the car park. So, if you go past there during a normal working day, there isn't room to park in the car park or the street or anywhere near their factory. But yet on a Saturday afternoon and on a Sunday, as I say, Sunday there was nobody there at all, and 10 cars. So they must be pretty confident in what they're doing, or they're not pushing as hard as they should do, because I've never worked in an F1 team where this time of year you weren't in there with most of your staff on a Saturday and a Sunday. But yeah, so if Red Bull can continue their curve, good, start the season strong, that's very, very important. And I say Ferrari sort of threw away an opportunity at the end of last season by not trying to get better in the area. They say, okay, we had a low concept car and we need a low drag concept car, and we need to sort of change the concept to increase the downforce levels. But you need those downforce levels to get the Pirelli tyres to work. So downforce is critically important at the moment with the tyres that we have as well. So Ferrari have a lot of work to do, I think.
I think with Red Bull, I'll almost be happiest if I see a car that doesn't have anything on it that makes you go, oh wow, that's a massive change. Because it's so important they just start the season well with something that they understand and can build from. They got to a good position last year, but it wasn't until Austria last year that they really got on top of the front wing. They had a series of upgrades over the races up to and including Austria. And then that sort of started to switch the car on. And then once into the second half of the season, they were a bit more consistently strong as well. So for those of us, and everyone, we want as many title contenders as we can do. But I'm getting a little bit frustrated with every year Red Bull sort of starting a bit iffily, sort of either starting anywhere between sort of okay and a bit iffy, and then getting good. Then you get to the end of the season, everyone goes, "Oh, brilliant! Yeah, Red Bull's on a great trajectory," and then they spend 5 races fiddling around. So if they can hit the ground running, chances are it will be with a good step. And if you're Ferrari, you're worried because there's no foregone conclusion that you will be the nearest challenger to Mercedes, because we know Mercedes is going to come out with a strong car.
I'm a little bit worried that Ferrari are going to, in a period where stability seems to be everything, last year of this aero regulation, they're going to change too much. I'm not saying it's going to be quite as aggressive, but I remember when McLaren ended, was it 2012, with the fastest car, and won the final race of the season. They looked really good, and they made loads of changes for 2013 because they thought that's the only way to really get on terms with Red Bull, and went backwards. It was the start of the decline that they're only just now trying to reverse. So I think Ferrari, there was a lot that needed to change. It's just whether or not they've changed the right things and in the right way. With Red Bull, that momentum at the start of the season, I remember speaking to Christian Horner at the end of last year about this, and he was he was trying to sort of dodge the accusation that they are traditionally slow starters in recent years. But the argument he put forward was that this year the aero change caught them out, hold their hands up at that. And was it in 2017, I think they started the year, and it took them a while to realise that they had some kind of miscorrelation with the wind tunnel. I think where the size of the car increased for 2017, and I don't think Red Bull properly accommodated for that with their wind tunnel work. So that set them back at the start of 17. And then in 2018, when they actually started the season stable aero regs from 17 to 18, and they thought, we've actually got a really good car here, a really good platform, they turn up for pre-season testing and the start of the year, and the Renault engine's not up to it compared to their rivals. So there always just seems to be this, whether you call it an excuse or just a reason, that they're not quite at the races, are they? And they need to do something this year that they haven't done in the V6 turbo hybrid era, which is go to Australia and be in contention to win.
This also is a year where you don't want to be playing catch-up, is it? Because there's major rule changes for 2021. I mean, Gary, you've been in a position where you've been working on one car and then you have a big rule change for the following year, varying. Perhaps never anything quite as massive as the 21 changes. They're quite significant, but obviously in your time, plenty of big changes. So how, if you're a technical director in a team, how difficult it is to balance those things up? And especially if you bring in, because ideally you start the season strongly, everything works really nicely, you build up all the points you need early on, you can basically transition a greater percentage of the resources onto next year's job done. There's only going to be a few teams here in that position, and everyone else will be varying levels of okay to struggling. So how do you go about concentrating on one season when you're also thinking about next year and creating those clever cockpit sides like you did in '96? You and Adrian Newey were the only ones, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very, very difficult to do both because you have to be big enough to sort of separate the team. I don't think that any team has the luxury of enough staff. The way they operate, I don't think any team has a luxury of enough staff to sort of divide them up too early. I know Mercedes and Ferrari and Red Bull have got huge staff numbers, and they may start up back into sort of Williams and Racing Point and so on. They've got less staff numbers, but the ambition is the same, and the way they work is the same. They use their maximum people to do the job they're doing. Everybody always has a few people that we're working on future projects, and obviously 2021 becomes a future project. But I think I don't think you can switch off this year because the money is so big for that one place in the Constructors' Championship that you have to try and achieve it. For any team's budget, that one place is a fairly major part of it. So it's a circle of events. You have to start the season, as you say, strong, and you have to make sure that you get momentum right through the season in 2020 to try and get that, those extra few points if you can. But the new regulations, because as you say, they are so different, it's a whole different mindset for it, really, to be honest. So you're going to have to put another group of people in place, and that's why the teams have been talking about the amount of money it costs. It's not just the hardware that we see; it's the background behind it, the amount that costs. So getting those people is very, very difficult. It's just management of your resource, I suppose, in the best way possible. But I think for any team, they've just got to buckle down, and they've got to look at 2020 being the challenge that's in front of them right now. 2021 becomes a different challenge, but probably, other than ticking along with your forward-thinking research group, you're probably really fire the ball up come June or July hard, because the 2021 regulations are so different that you're going to see huge changes during 2021. So you just, again, it's the same old deal. You got to get the best package you can put together for pre-season testing in 2021, and that'll be X, whatever it be, and there'll be changes going on to it anyway. So I wouldn't get super excited about 2021 now. I'd make sure that 2020 was as productive as possible.
It's always interesting looking at some of the case studies in the past. The one extreme is obviously the Brawn year in 2009. Honda basically put pretty much all of their R&D budget for the 2008 car into the 2009 car. So everyone always says, well, do you completely write off a year? But I think, as you said there, you can't do that. But it is interesting looking at some of the previous cases, because, for example, remember in 2013, obviously, big changes for 2014. And Red Bull obviously demolished the second half of the season in particular. I mean, they were strong all the way through. But I remember a few people at Mercedes saying that they were quite happy to see Red Bull was still firing parts at the car to make sure they won whatever it was, ridiculous number of races in a row that Sebastian Vettel won, because it wasn't actually doing a great deal for Red Bull, because they were going to win the championship anyway, and I almost felt it suggested that they were focusing almost too much on the previous year. So there's that sort of fine balance, isn't it? I always feel that your ideal position is if you start strong, that gives you control over your destiny, doesn't it? Because that theoretically you should then secure a good position in the championship quite early on, and then because you've got a little bit of credit in the bank over some of your competitors, you think, well, we can maybe leave a couple of tenths on the shelf development because we don't need it. Whereas if you're playing catch up and you're thinking, oh, we're in a tight battle, we want to finish fifth in the constructors rather than seventh, then that question becomes much trickier.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. If you've got a big enough cushion, but I don't see it that way. As I say, this is the second year of these regulations. I don't see why between those top three teams, there would be a big cushion, enough to sort of give up a few races because of that. And even from there backwards, from fourth backwards, all those teams, or those fourth, fifth, and sixth, are really pushing hard to try and close the gap down, but they're also trying to push hard to stay fourth. So there's two races within one race, and you're always out trying to win it. And that race for fourth is just as hard, if not harder, than the race for first. So I think you're going to see the teams pushing on, and I think you got to say that if it was me, I'd be saying let's let 2021 look after itself, I suppose you might say. Manage it well enough and do enough research as you can. But the way the regulations are written now, it's so, for 2021, it's so definitive. Everything is placed in sort of space somewhere. So it's about drawing the car up and then looking at all those opportunities. And to be honest, there's not that many. That's what they try to do, is cut back the opportunities. So actually, 2021 car could be easier than a 2020 car.
That's a very good point. One thing while we're talking about the top teams we should do, Scott, is maybe we've mentioned Mercedes in passing a few times here. We've got so used to Mercedes being the yardstick that it almost is taken as read, isn't it? So what are you expecting to see from them? We don't normally see vast dramatic concept changes in terms of, everyone a few years ago was saying, oh, they're going to go to high rake, everyone's going high rake. But Mercedes has such a great understanding of how to make its car work and build on its car concept to make sure it's most competitive across the average of the season. Is there any reason to expect anything particularly different from them?
Well, the way of going about things has worked pretty well over the last 6 seasons, hasn't it? So I can imagine that they'll probably aim to just do the usual bit, which is basically just do everything to a really, really high level. I think we talked about this, I think it was on the last podcast, that they're not perfect as a race team. with car design, engine design. They're not perfect, but they do such a good job that they look like they're perfect always. And they'll go out, they'll do a shakedown at Silverstone when they launch the car, and they'll complete as many laps as is allowed in a filming day. And there'll be a video that comes out where Lewis is driving the car and he says, "Oh my God, this thing feels incredible." And then they'll go to Barcelona and they'll probably smash in as many laps over 6 days as they did in 8 days last year or something. I would be surprised if they did anything other than lay down the gauntlet, at least in terms of productivity and efficiency. We're not really. We saw last year what they do performance-wise at the start isn't really what's relevant. But I can just see them going through, and all the teams are going to go there with their to-do list. And I think Mercedes is just going to be the one that checks everything off better than the rest.
Gary, obviously you've been through plenty of eras where there's been one team dominating. Obviously, perhaps almost, well, it is unprecedented, 6 back-to-back titles. We have seen, obviously, Ferrari managed 6 and 5 titles in a. But what's it like when you're up against a team like that? Are you like some of the fans at home just getting bored of it happening, or do you just think, oh God, these people are so good? How are we going to get to that level? How do you see how will the other teams be feeling about what Mercedes is doing?
Well, you've always got your challenge. No matter what team you are, you've always got a team that's close to you that your challenge is to beat them. And on cases of, let's say, McLaren backwards, Renault, Haas, Racing Point or whatever, their challenge is not Mercedes, and it's not Red Bull, and it's not Ferrari. But within those three themselves, their challenge is to beat each other. So you've always got your challenge. If somebody like Toro Rosso, think, or whatever they call themselves, AlphaTauri.
AlphaTauri, yeah,
AlphaTauri.
clothing brand.
Yeah, AlphaTauri. Yeah, I don't have any of those clothes.
With your fashion sense, that's unbelievable, Gary.
If AlphaTauri has an ambition to catch Mercedes, then they're going to be disappointed for the rest of their life. So you can't set yourself there. You have to set yourself at the next step, and that's why I say if it's climbing this ladder, you take each step at a time. You got to move forward, or otherwise you just destroy your motivation. So you always look at what's around you and why you're getting beaten by them, or why you're beating somebody else, and try and improve yourself that little bit. So much of it relies on other people, what they do as well coming into a new season, because somebody could get it right. There's no reason why Racing Point might be lucky. Yes, it would have to be lucky, but to be competitive with somebody else, with up the front, and suddenly they're running for third in the championship. That could happen. It's very unlikely, but it could happen. But it would be because of luck. So you wouldn't expect it to continue. It would just be a happening because they got some stuff right. And but you always got to set your goal at beating the guy ahead of you, no matter whether that's for 4th or 5th or 3rd or 1st. No matter what it is, you've got to try and get that guy ahead of you, and then you can look at the next one.
When Gary, do you think these teams will be getting an idea of how close they are to achieving that goal? So Ferrari, for example, there's all sorts of rumours coming out of Italy, as there always are, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, that they're not where they need to be, that the work they're doing behind the scenes isn't currently yielding positive results. So there's doubt as to whether they're going to have the downforce they need to improve the car as much as they want to. Is that I struggle to take that too seriously, because I know what Italy's like for this sort of thing, especially when it comes to Ferrari. But how is it realistic for them to have an idea of how good they think their car's going to be, or is it still guesswork until you get to testing or even Australia?
No, it is realistic. I mean, I would say that if I was Ferrari, I would be playing it down a bit going into 2020 as well, because obviously last year, 2019, from the initial testing and from them, they were going to conquer the world. We all thought they were going to. So the right thing to do is play it down a little bit this year. The biggest problem, I suppose, for them is, it's only how good your simulation tools are. Whenever you think, you're running this stuff in CFD, you're running it in the wind tunnel, you're going to go to a track in Barcelona testing, which is, average temperature during the day is probably going to be in the teens, maybe high teens. And it's been cold all winter. So the track surfaces, the mass of the track is cool. The aerodynamic characteristics change from there to sort of a circuit like Bahrain, or those early warm circuits is massive. The humidity, the surface temperatures, the ambient temperatures, all of that stuff changes how the aerodynamics work. So you've got to be very, very careful that your simulation that you're doing right now back in the factory is relative to last year's car, and you're getting numbers of an improvement or or not, as the case may be. Obviously, Ferrari, they needed to find, 2 or 3, 4% more downforce from their car. They want to find it as efficient, so they want the drag level to be the same. So those are the numbers that they're working with their simulation tool. If they can get that, then from the factory point of view, you'd be saying, yeah, okay, we're on our way forward. All right, that's okay. Except for if you're working an aerodynamic surface just that bit harder to get that extra downforce, when you get to hotter conditions, that aerodynamic surface can just fail, it can stall. So although your figures that you have from factory simulation can lead you in a direction, there is no substitute for actually running on a track and letting the stopwatch tell you the truth.
Well, we talked quite a bit about the front runners, so we'll move on to the mid-pack in a moment. We'll talk about some of those teams after this.
At the Bank of Santander, they've created Stan, a smart bot that can predict the future of remortgaging.
I read Stan. Will my mortgage rate go up?
1955 was the last time Newcastle won the cup.
No, and try not to mumble.
Playing, let's get ready to rumble.
Meanwhile, at Santander, they can't predict your future, but they'll help secure it with great mortgage rates fixed for up to 10 years. See what's possible at Santander.
Early repayment charges apply. Lending subject to status and criteria. Your home may be repossessed if you do not keep up repayments on your mortgage.
Right, well, there are 7 other teams in Formula One who will be, you could cruelly say making up the numbers, but creating the other storylines as well as the, aside from the battle for the championship. Loads of interesting teams there, but I thought I'd ask everyone to pick one team that they're particularly interested to see how they do and what their car's like. So, Scott, which of those other 7 teams are you most interested to see what they can do and what their car's like?
I'm going to pick Renault because I think they're the team with the most on the line from this season. I think it makes or breaks whether Renault is still in F1 basically beyond 2020. Maybe they'll still see out 2021. But I think if they go backwards or even stay the same this year, it's going to be a massive problem. It's going to be interesting to see the car because they had such an obvious problem last year with the development in particular, because they started off and things weren't special, but things weren't too bad. But it was just everything they promised. It was just, that's not delivered. And Daniel Ricciardo and Nico Hülkenberg said several times last year, every time they thought they were going to build a bit of momentum, then they have a really bad result. And it's not a great sign when the Renault Works team's strongest results last year came at tracks where it was sort of top speed dependent. That's not a very good indicator of the quality of the car that they had. So be interesting to see if there's anything visibly different on the car, so you can sort of spot some early trends as to how they've addressed it, but then sort of bigger picture as well, because they've got this. They've got Pat Fry's come over. He was a Team Enstone man a long time ago, wasn't he?
Yeah, back in the day.
Sort of a homecoming of sorts, but it's he's going to have a big job on his hands. You've got just the way they go about the aero side this year is going to be crucial for them with Dirk de Beer coming across as well. It's a different technical team now on the car side, the aero side. So how they develop and so what they put forward initially, how they develop it, and then what signs we see of their attention maybe switching to 2021. Because if they're sticking around beyond 2020, it has to be to get 21 right. So for all sorts of reasons, I think Renault is I'm quite interested to see how it plays out in the midfield for them.
Yeah, Renault is certainly the one that I'm particularly interested to see their car, because there's good scope for aerodynamic concept changes there, particularly with the front end. Gary, is there a team that you're clamouring to see?
Well, just topping up that little bit on Renault there. Yeah, I mean the pressure's on them for sure. They should be easily the dominant fourth team, if not joining that top 3. They are a works team, so they've really in the last few years they've really got it wrong, I suppose you might call it. And they need to step forward. But from my point of view, I think, again, the momentum of McLaren would be something that I would hope would close that gap up to the top 3. I'm not saying they can join the top 3 just yet, but I'm saying that the momentum's there. Both Lando Norris and Sainz Jr. did a really, really strong job last year. And they did it, they brought a smile back to McLaren's face, which that smile on the face, there's a lot of momentum in that. It really does help you through the winter season whenever you've got that belief in where you were going to and how you're doing it. And they've got some new staff, got new technical director, new team principal, but the staff that's there before they came did a very, very good job for 2019. So I can see that momentum keeping going. The problem, I suppose, for them is if they do change direction a bit with their car concept to try and get more downforce out of it, which is their stated sort of ploy, then you can lose yourself just as quickly as gain ground. But I think McLaren have got a firm handle on it, and I think because of the troubles they've had over the last few years, they've been able to look at it quite deeply. So they're the ones that I think I would hope to see close that gap down and do a strong job, and we all want them to. We need 4 teams at the front for sure fighting. 3's good, but 4 would be much better.
On the subject of that concept change, it was talked about a lot last year. I asked James Key about that late in the season. James Key, of course, You taught him everything he knows, didn't you? from a colleague of yours.
No, a good guy.
And he said it's perhaps best not to think of it as like a whole car changing concept, but he said it was about there are some areas where they know there's big performance gains, but they've not really got into. And this is all about that huge chasm between the top 3 teams and the rest. There is kind of a glass ceiling there in terms of understanding what I like to call the underlying science. And I think that's what McLaren are really trying to get into, areas where they can really start understanding the advanced trickery, for want of a better word. It's all legal, but the top teams do. This is something you've spoken about, Gary, when it comes to the impact of the steering lock and the dive at the front and the braking and controlling the aero centre of pressure. That's hugely complex, isn't it? And that's clearly one of those areas of understanding that you've got to, you need to spend years working on it. And I think that'll be one of the areas McLaren will be trying to at least lay the foundations for a step change in.
The driver gets confidence in his car, during the transient stage of going into a corner. He arrives going down the straight, he doesn't care what the car's doing. He just wants it to be going quickly. So drag's important. Then you hit the brake pedal, and from that point in time until you get the throttle flat out, every state's transient. You're putting different steering lock on, the car's rolling, it's yawing, everything's happening. You're reducing speed, you're gaining speed. So all that stuff through that corner is what gives the driver confidence. And if any of that is peaky and not consistent, then that's where you get problems. And it's so difficult to get all that stuff leveled out because every corner profile is such from you hit the brake pedal to you get full throttle again. It's always a different type of corner. It might be 90 degrees, it might be 180 degrees, it could be 70 degrees, but it could be also 110 kilometres an hour, it could be 220 kilometres an hour. Very, very varying. And that's the area you have to concentrate on. Now, to do that all in the wind tunnel, and the wind tunnel time that you're now allowed is quite difficult. In the past, when you could run the wind tunnel from break of dawn to night time, or 24 hours a day,
more than one in some cases.
More than one. You used to be able to go through all those scenarios and try to get the car that covered everything, and trying to get the information that covered everything. So you knew every point of downforce through a car's transient condition. Now you can't do that. So a lot of the teams are being led astray by saving this money because they're not running the wind tunnel, because they just can't spend the time in making sure the parts that they're putting on the cars actually are working properly. Yeah, they're working properly as far as giving downforce at some points in time, but not all the time.
Yeah, I think that's it's hugely complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is really, really difficult stuff, and it takes time. And I'm quite encouraged to see McLaren quite happy to talk about kind of a gap in their knowledge and where they need to work at this. So I think Scott earlier referenced that 2013 car concept change. I think this is a slightly different situation. There is always the risk if you do that, you're doing something for no reason. And that 2012 car, better operation, better reliability, that car probably should have won the championship. It's kind of the forgotten last great McLaren, if you like, but I've digressed a bit there. I'm going to choose a team, and I'm going to choose your old team, Gary, Racing Point, which obviously started as Jordan. You were there when it was just an empty industrial unit at Silverstone. And of course, we should say that team will become Aston Martin Racing in 2021. So for more on that, check out our special extra episode of this podcast where we discussed that in depth. Last year, I think of as a year zero for Racing Point. They had to... The investment that came in 2018 was too late to fully impact last season, so they had to do things like they carried on with the same gearbox and rear suspension, etc., because they just had to make their decisions when they didn't fully know the picture of resource. And Andrew Green, the technical director, he was there at the start of Jordan as well. fantastic technical director, Andrew Green, really knows his stuff. Someone really worth listening to when he talks. I mean, he said that this is an all new car. This is the blank sheet of paper first racing point. So I'm really interested to see what they can do. Because if you look at it last year, that car wasn't brilliant, but operationally they executed it so well. On average, it was the 9th fastest car. Yet you had Sergio Perez. If you do the Class B points by eliminating the top 3 as we like to do, he was second in the championship because they just executed really well. That team, pound for pound, it's a very good team, and you could probably only say that maybe it's up there with sort of Red Bull and Mercedes in terms of the execution of races. But I'm really interested to see how much the car changes, and it's also I'm interested to see that from a for better or for worse perspective, because obviously, as you've talked about in the past, Gary, expanding teams is not an easy thing, and there's a lot of distractions potentially there. So you want to hope that they've made a good, sensible step, not an excessive step, but focusing on the right areas. A bit like McLaren, trying to advance their underlying understanding to put them thoroughly in the hunt for that best of the midfield. Because you can bet that Lawrence Stroll, who heads the consortium who owns it, wants that team to be in there for best of the rest this season as a waypoint towards getting to fight at the front in a few years.
Yeah, for sure he does. I mean, it's very difficult. For sure, point one racing point. Sorry, are
just call it Midland or Spiker or
there's been
all these other names.
There's a few names there, so if we get it nearly right, it's okay. They're a very good race team. They do understand about racing, and when it comes to Friday morning at a racetrack, they usually work very hard on getting the best out of what they got, and they know what they got. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, but they get the best out of it they can. And that's vitally important. It's not where you are up and down the grid or up and down the performance stakes. You just got to get the best out of what you have. But this, for me, the big worry would be right at the moment is that the dreams might be a little bit too far away. They might just need to sort of regroup a little bit and make sure that they do what they do well consistently with the group of people they have. And any new big investment has to be with new people coming in. Just don't upset what you've got for the future, because it doesn't happen overnight. And I'm sure people want results. For sure they want results. For sure they want to be ahead of that midfield at least. But it's so difficult. You just got to make sure you do what you do well and do it consistently. And Racing Point need to do that. Don't get into dreamland too quickly because you've got a big sponsor or you've got a big owner who can dip deep in his pockets. So that's all okay, and that's for the future. But let some other people look after the future a little bit. Make sure your technical group and the way of doing stuff doesn't get destroyed by diluting it too much with too many plans for the future.
Well, that's a few of the midfield teams we talked about. We'll be back in a moment to take some of the listener questions, some of which do cover some of the other teams, but we've had great response to people getting in touch with us to pose some questions. So we'll be back with that after this.
WW Weight Watchers Reimagined have a new customised weight loss programme, MyWW, where no foods are off limit. Just fill out a simple assessment and get matched to a plan that suits you. You love eating carbs, cooking at home or eating out? No problem with this new customised plan. Discover which new MyWW plan can make losing weight easier for you. Join now and get 50% off your first 3 months. Offer ends 8th of February. Subscription fees and conditions apply. Mainland UK only. See website for details.
Well, there's been a great response to our new podcast. We've had loads of questions from listeners to our account on Twitter, which is @WeAreTheRace. So we'll try and pick through some of them now. Sadly, we'd have to have a 5-hour podcast to get through all of them. So apologies if we don't get to your question. But there's a question here from Phil McQuilliam. Assuming Williams don't repeat their disaster of a season last year, who do you think is likely to be languishing at the back of the grid this year?
I mean, that's a difficult one, obviously. I mean, Williams have been on a bit of a downhill slope since 2016, really, I suppose you might call it. So it was a continual build-up, 2016 to 19. I think that's 4 seasons, really, it took them to hit the real doldrums. So it's not going to happen overnight that they end up in that middle of that midfield bunch. In George Russell, they have, in my opinion, a very, very good driver. So if you give him the tools, he'll do the job. The one team I don't see really moving forward is Alfa Romeo, I suppose. I'm not sure why they should move forward. because they've got Kimi, and obviously he's very good, but he's getting a little bit long in the tooth. But as a team, they seem to be sort of stuck out on this little independent thing. They're stuck in Switzerland. They're away from everything else. They're not sort of connected up to what we classify as a sort of Formula One world, which is the UK. But they're just sort of detached away from the central motor racing world, I suppose, and they've stuck with that. They've stuck with that themselves. And okay, they're backed by Ferrari now, and they got Ferrari bits on the car, potentially got Ferrari bits on the car. They got Kimi Räikkönen, but I don't see why they should move forward, because as a team they've been Sauber, they've been round the block a few times, and I don't see that moving forward. Williams could move forward because they're determined, they are committed, they understand they did things wrong, but I don't think that Alfa Romeo know that they did things wrong. They haven't really got anything to blame. Williams have a lot to blame. So I would say Alfa Romeo would be the team for me that would be the most consistent at the back. Hopefully they'll not be as detached as what Williams were, as you say, in 2019, but racing at the back and mixing it with the rest of the bunch. So that's a really critical area. That I've been there down the back, and it's tough. It's really, really tough to get the best out of your car on a given weekend and try to keep the momentum up within the team, because the head goes down very, very quickly. So whoever's stuck there, it's going to be difficult for them.
At least they've not got a Yamaha engine. Nobody's dealing with that. As
it was called a few times, a ship's anchor.
I also remember you saying that the upgrades on it tend to make it louder but not faster.
Yeah, well, Stefan in Modena, he used to be quite good. He said, whenever you're driving with the car, everything feels great. The engine's singing, but it's like a sewing machine. He said it's all making lots of noise and going very, very quickly, the engine, but it just feels like if you put your finger on it, it'll stop. He said it's got no torque, it's got no strength, just lots and lots of noise around you. That was until it blew up usually. And that's a lot of noise. Bit
of a struggle of a season. Well, Scott, Barnard Star asks, how realistic do you think an Alonso return in a competitive car is in 2021? So kind of a two-part question there.
Oh, that's a good one. I quite like that. Thanks for throwing that to me. I suspect it's about as realistic as Vettel walking away from Ferrari at the end of this year. I think it's possible. It hinges on other factors. I think in Alonso's case, it might well depend on what Vettel does. I think his preference would obviously be to take Hamilton's seat at Mercedes. So maybe, I don't know, some hypothetical scenarios. Maybe Vettel decides to leave, Ferrari convinces Hamilton to move over, and then Merc can sign Alonso. But it's a bit of a stretch. I just think he says that he's ready and willing to come back to F1. He says he's pushing for it as much as he can be. But I just think he's only going to come back if there's a race-winning car available. I think unless there's a way that Mercedes can get Verstappen out of his Red Bull contract, I can't. Maybe Alonso would represent the only available top-line driver that Mercedes could get if Hamilton left. Because you're not going to put, if you're Mercedes and you stay in F1, you're not going to have a Bottas, George Russell lineup, are you? I don't think that's really going to cut it in a title context. So maybe Alonso's best chance is Hamilton leaves Mercedes and there's a vacancy there. But I struggle to see it personally, but never say never.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. I mean, I think if there was a competitive car there for him, he would never have left. And as soon as a competitive car becomes available, he'll be back. But is a competitive car ever going to be available to him is a much, much bigger question. I mean, there's quite a few questions here we've already touched on during the podcast. So I don't want to sort of go over old grounds. Ian Hamilton, for example, asked about McLaren's expectations. So various questions there. But there's also one about drivers, Gary, saying how important will the intra-team battle between Esteban Ocon and Daniel Ricciardo be for their careers? This is from Rasmus Vestergaard. Obviously, Ocon's an ambitious young driver. Daniel Ricciardo in the middle of his career, in the prime of his F1 career, but very much desperate to get at least a shot at having a title push. Now, you know a lot about driver dynamics and young drivers in particular. You've a lot of time in your career you had younger drivers trying to make their names. So how important is that battle going to be for those two, and how tricky could it be for Renault to manage and get the best out of them?
I think you just cross-reference it to Charles Leclerc and and Vettel at Ferrari. You can't keep young guys down. If you've got a talent, you're going to come in and you're going to use it to the best possible. And the most important thing is that you get compared to your teammates. You've got to beat your teammate. And that's Ocon's challenge. Everybody knows, I think, that if you give Daniel Ricciardo a car that's capable, he can win races. He has won races in a car that's capable. So he is a good yardstick for Ocon. So those two will have their own battle. Where that takes him in the big picture of Formula One in general, in reality, it doesn't matter to Ocon. He just needs to beat his teammate and do as solid a job as possible for the team. As Leclerc just needs to beat Sebastian Vettel, or as Hamilton just needs to beat Bottas, or Bottas beat Hamilton. If you can do that consistently, that's what you get recognised as. So challenge is just within the team. Do the best job possible. Keep your head down. Work for the team. Make sure you don't let your ego get ahead of what the team want. That's what happens a lot of times whenever you see people like Perez and Ocon at Racing Point, as it was at that point in time, driving into each other. That's whenever one's ego gets a bit bigger than the others, or than the team, and you need to sort of trim that and make sure you keep it under control. Ocon needs to do that. Don't go and drive into the side of Daniel Ricciardo, because he'll take that bad boy image with him that he had at Force India a bit. So keep your nose clean, go and beat your teammate, and then you'll move forward.
And if the drivers step out of line, you can always use the patented Gary Anderson, have them up against the wall of the garage. Yeah,
not so many people do that these days. I don't see why you shouldn't settle things quickly and easily by just pinning the driver against the wall by his throat. But it'd be nice to see that sort of stuff again. But I think people might look at it as a bit oddball.
The driver in question was Andrea De Cesaris, wasn't it? A driver who you speak very highly of, but obviously on that day he was causing.
Andrea was a great guy, but he said some stuff that he probably didn't need to say. To tell you the whole story, he went over a curb in Barcelona with a car, and he split the chassis right down the corner of where the seatbelts were. And there was a red flag for some other reason, so he came to the pits and had a look. And I decided that really it was a bit dangerous, because the split was 30 centimetres long, and it was right across where the seatbelt anchor is. So I said to him he had to take a spare car, and he didn't want to go in the spare car, he wanted to go in that car. And he turned around to me and he said, if that was Roberto Moreno, and Roberto was a very good friend of mine, he said, if it was Roberto Moreno was driving this car, you'd fix it. And I got a bit upset with him. Because of this red flag, he got out of the car. So I pinned him against the wall, and I just said, look, I'm doing this for you. I don't want you going out there and crashing the car. The chassis falling in two, you hurting yourself, me getting the blame. We have a problem with the car. Get in a spare car and just drive it. Sorted.
Yeah, that's called diplomacy. What you're exercising now. We've got another question from Rohit Subramanian, who says: is the cost cap enforced from 2021, or does it apply to 2021 development? And if it's the former, aren't all the big teams going to pour more money in over the next year to get on top of the regs and leave the midfield teams where they are right now? Yeah, the cost cap applies to 2021 spending in the calendar year, and there've been a lot of worries about teams spending excessively. There will be some extra expenditure, I imagine, particularly from the teams that have got the money to invest, but I suspect a lot more of it will be in some of the capital investments in the factory, that kind of thing, just making sure you've got the things you need to do done that don't have to go against your balance, as it were, in 2021. But inevitably, people will be cognizant of the impending cost cap. But of course, for a lot of the teams, the cost cap is going to be too high to be especially relevant as well, especially when drivers are involved. If you had a cost cap to get out, would you be there ordering many millions of tons of bolts and things just to have sat in your garage just in case? Well,
the problem is, probably half of the teams can only dream about a budget level of what the cost cap is, including drivers and management and everything. As far as I'm aware now, it's 175 million, plus the drivers' fees, plus the top three personnel in the company, plus. So, we hear Lewis Hamilton's asking for $60 million. I mean, that's a third of the amount of money that the cost cap is. So that's ridiculous, in reality. So, as I say, the money they're talking about is just way too high to offer any assistance to the smaller teams, or at least half of the teams on the grid. As for the others, it's not been questioned, and it's not been beaten, it's not been dragged up, because they know themselves that the cost cap, as I say, plus the drivers, plus the top three management and whatever, the commercial department, if they add all that up, that is probably the budget they've got now. So there's no the cost cap isn't forming any budget control whatsoever. It's a start, but I think there's ways around all that stuff, and I think it's a dismal way of going about it, to be honest, because, as I say, the teams that need the money, that need to be able to spend the money, just can only dream about that sort of level.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's going to be it's going to take a few years to really see the impacts, and obviously there is a desire for a bit of a glide path in terms of reducing the spending. But I should mention the whole thing about spending glide paths. We've heard that before with the resource restriction agreement of just over a decade ago. So this is a much more rigid, firm agreement. The financial regulations do actually exist along with the sporting and technical regulations. So it's a bit more of a firm deal. I should say quite a few questions we haven't got to, but quite a few of them we have touched on in the previous two editions of the podcast. There's some questions there about Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari, which we covered in the second podcast, and one's about Red Bull's treatment of drivers, which we covered in our first one. So do have a look back if you want to hear some of those. Now, this is a stage in the podcast where, sadly, we have to hand over to Scott Mitchell for his whimsical segment that is still titled Scott's People. I haven't quite completed sorting a jingle for it, but I haven't found anything suitably ludicrous yet, but I'm getting there. So Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. No, I like this just because, as we've said before, it's just a bit of light-hearted fun. So the first couple were basically just people sending in pictures and like really random places that spotted F1 drivers, but I wanted to make it a little bit more sort of whimsical this time. So last time I asked for people to throw in some spotted animal mascots at either F1 races or paddocks and stuff like that. It just reminded me of when I was back when I was a kid and going karting, and you'd have like half a dozen people with motorhomes or caravans around the paddock, and they'd like a few of them would like bring their dogs, and you just end up at some point with like a golden retriever running down and someone desperately trying to stop it from running onto the kart track, which would obviously be an absolute disaster in an F1 race. So unsurprisingly, we've got the obligatory someone spotted Lewis Hamilton's dog, but I'm including it because I just thought it was quite an amusing story. It's from Christian Rose. He said he was in the paddock at testing last year, and he saw a huge scrum of cameras and people heading down the paddock. He thought it was like Hamilton or Vettel or someone. So he went over to see who it was. It turned out to be Roscoe being walked by a security guard. Actually, I thought that was fantastic. At Motorcar Diaries sent in a picture of a bald eagle flying above Daytona and what he calls, quote, the famous Minardi dog, which I've never heard of, and I've asked a couple of people now who have not heard of this. But it's a picture of someone wearing a Minardi jacket holding a very small dog. They're about to watch an Italian Formula 3 race back in 2009. But if anyone's ever heard of the famous Minardi dog, I'd love to actually know what particularly makes it famous. It's probably just an owner that's got like a retro Minardi jacket and just turned up to racetracks with their pet. Our MotoGP correspondent, Simon Patterson, sent in a few pictures, which properly bought into the idea, and it just triggered a good bit of fun because he sent in a photo of MotoGP rider Jack Miller with his dog. He's got a bulldog that he took to the Czech Republic last year. That Aussie MotoGP rider Jack Miller, and also a photo of a goose and a duck at Valentino Rossi's riding ranch. Absolutely random. But what was quite surprising is that opened up a really rich vein of MotoGP related animals, because he shared a photo of a stray cat interrupting Cal Crutchlow's media session. And Ed, you'll remember, former MotoGP reporter Mitchell Adam absolutely loves it when a cat interrupts stuff, because at F1 testing a few years ago, there was a stray cat that kept running down the pit lane, which he got really excited about.
That was in Abu Dhabi, yeah. I remember seeing that cat. I was out there.
And yeah, I think they crop up, stray animals crop up all the time. But Mitchell shared a photo of what was supposedly the same cat from a different Crutchlow media session that weekend. And he named it Cat Crutchlow, which I thought was just absolutely abysmal. But the absolute peak of this was the conclusion of this conversation led to someone, Josie, who got involved. And it turns out she's got a blog, a blog called The Mutts of MotoGP, where she basically just documents MotoGP riders and their pets. So Maverick Vinales has got a chocolate Labrador, and there's a video of Paul Espargaro racing his husky down a road. Espargaro's on a scooter, and this massively fluffy husky is just giving it the absolute beans, chasing after him. So all of that stuff's very, very endearing. Gary, I'm led to believe that you've got a dog. Have you ever taken your dog to a racetrack?
No, I haven't taken my dog. I've got a Cairn Terrier. Well, my dog. It's my grandkid's dog and my wife's dog and my dog. I've got a Cairn Terrier. Yeah, lovely little animal. But no, I'd like to bring this little episode to a bit of a sad end, really, if it's all right with you. Again, it was testing. It was in Argentina in the late 70s, I think it was. And
I should warn everyone, all of Gary's most ridiculous stories come from Argentina.
Well, there's a few from here and there, but Argentina, yeah. And we were running around the track, all merrily, testing away, and the red flag was put up at the end of the pit lane, so everybody drove into the pits. There was this huge dog ran across the pit straight. The next thing is there was this gun ringing out, a noise of a bullet going off. Green flag went at the end of the pit lane, and off we went for testing. So, yes, that was a bit of a sad dog story, but it was, dogs and racing cars, to be honest, on the track, obviously they don't mix, or motorbikes or anything like that, but they need to be kept under control if you are taking them to the racetrack, so that's why I'd never take mine.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. South America is it's very common for there to be a lot of stray animals, stray dogs around in particular.
Was that kind of military rule era Argentina?
Yes, I think it was 78, probably.
Are you absolutely certain it was the dog that the gun was being shot at?
The dog didn't reappear and there was a bullet went off, so it could have been anything, to be honest. Actually, it's quite strange.
I imagine many people didn't reappear.
They were standing on the roof of the garages, the military, with the guns out. There was one on every roof all the way along the pit lane. So it was a bit of a testing time, I think. But, we got there.
We can get end on a bit more of a high. I'll throw out the question. I'll throw out the question that I want to ask for the next podcast that we do, and it's slightly inspired by the fact that you're on this podcast, Gary, because I'm pretty sure you would be part of Ed's answer to this. So I'm curious because I always
like... Is this about troublesome colleagues?
I always like the sort of hypothetical scenario. When people are asked to put together like their dream dinner party, sort of who would you have as your guests? So I'm going to ask our listeners and readers on social media, I'm going to ask if they could invite 3 F1 people, any era from when the World Championship started in 1950. If you could invite 3 F1 people to your dream dinner, who would it be and why? So I picked that because I'm pretty sure, Gary, you'd be on Ed's list.
Anyone who can tell stories about the Jordan 191. Exactly. That's what you need. Although you also need some people. I think you need some... You need some aggravation, so you'd have to get some people who don't get on. I'm sure we can find a few people you don't get on.
No, there's a few around.
I think you'd have Gary, someone you could pitch him against, and you'd have an Iceland driver as well, wouldn't you?
Just so Rolf Stommelen.
You can tell Rolf Stommelen because his eyes were quite far apart to see past that rear view mirror he had.
Yeah, that was a Eifeland's one of my favourite cars. It's great to see it's there, and there's a restored the restored car's been restored and it's running, which is great. Yeah. Absolutely brilliant.
See, this is the point of this part of the podcast. It's just where the podcast descends into the realm of being ridiculous.
Yeah, that's why we give this segment to you, because you do bring the ridiculousness. Well, I think we've gone on for quite long enough now. We obviously will be hearing from Gary on the podcast every now and again, but there will also be a Gary Anderson F1 show podcast coming soon. Of course, we'll have plenty of podcasts coming on. Normally this podcast comes out once a week, but once we get into the launches, we'll try and do a quick short podcast on each and every launch to talk about the car with various people cropping up on that. And then once we get to testing, we'll be bringing some daily reports and analysis on what's been going on. We'll all be out at both the tests. Of course, it's just 6 days of pre-season testing this year, which is going to be fascinating to see how people are going. And of course, follow us on social media on @WeAreTheRace. And so if you've got any questions, please do fling it at that. We try and get to as many as we possibly can. Well, thanks very much, Scott Mitchell and Gary Anderson. I suspect the next time we'll all be together will be for testing, or probably not a launch, but certainly the first test. So there'll be lots to talk about there. So yeah, we'll be back shortly, probably with the first of our launch podcasts.